recommend your book to our students as well. And it's time for me to introduce our next speaker, which is not an unknown character to PowerUs. You are not either, of course, but Peter is one of the founders. And for those of you who don't know Peter, he's at present a professor of citizen participation at the University of Essex in the UK. And he's an activist and a frequent contributor to The Garden, among other things, writing on social policy. And we're very happy that you're with us today, Peter. Please go ahead.
Thanks.
And I ask everybody else to turn off their microphones, especially.
Thanks, Cecilia, and thanks, Vishanti. It's lovely to be here, and it's lovely to have an association with such a helpful international organisation as PowerUs. And my focus is user involvement in social work and professional education and learning. And as well as the things that Cecilia said, I identify as someone who is a mental health service user, has been for a number of years. And I just wanted to touch on a book which is coming out in a couple of days that I've written because it relates to this presentation. And this is a book about ideology and involvement, having a say in ideology. And I realized, thinking about this, that ideology, the ideas and values that shape our lives politically, is something that we've almost not realized we need to have a say in, and we have very little say in it, and it's relevant to what I want to talk about.
Okay, could you hold up the book a little longer while you're speaking?
I think it'd be difficult.
Thank you.
I can give people information. And I'm pleased to say, next to what Vishanti said, it's published by a not-for-profit organisation. I'm going to focus, obviously, from my experience, particularly on the UK, in what I say today. But so much has been achieved, both in the UK and internationally, in relation to our focus. Here we know that for years now, there's been a requirement for user and carer involvement in all aspects, all stages of social work education, which has expanded, and money to pay for it from central government. Then there's the development of the PowerUs approach, pioneered, as we know, at Lund University, with people co-working as service users and carers and as students, gaining invaluably knowledge, trust, familiarity and recognition as the basis for successful practice later on, and we'll be hearing about that also in other contexts. Also, I think the way that increasingly this involvement has sought to address diversity has been concerned with inclusive involvement, addressing groups facing some of the biggest barriers, all approaches in terms of language, age, citizen status, involving unaccompanied minors, involving refugees and asylum seekers, women experiencing domestic violence, and so on. An incredible track record. And then along comes COVID-19. And going back to the book, we really need to remember that the outcomes in relation to this health emergency have been very different in different societies and countries, from the high death rates in heavy ideologized countries like the UK, Brazil, and Trump's US, to the much better controlled, less terrible consequences in societies like South Korea, New Zealand and Taiwan, where there seems to be much more positive relationships between governments and people. The general response in the UK from the government in relation to involvement, it's been to say, we haven't got time for it really, that in a time of emergency, we'll just go back to how we always used to do things. To devalue traditional science, it's not been the experts who've really led the way here, although they've had the knowledge and the research data to do so, but instead shaped very much by ideological pressures. So we've had a disastrous failure in relation to track, trace and test, although it's so important. Significantly, though, both ignoring traditional science and its knowledge, and also the kind of experiential knowledge from involvement that Vishanti was highlighting, and which we know from our own work is so important. But the valuable insights the latter has offered, I know that the first I knew of the important symptom of not being able to smell or taste, was very early on from someone who had got COVID when it wasn't being mentioned by scientists or politicians. And then, of course, all that valuable expertise from people who are used to surviving lockdown from their day-to-day life as disabled people, stuck perhaps at home always or even restricted to bed. So it's a routine experience, and all that they had to offer about how we might survive better under such circumstances very much ignored. And now we've learned after a year here under lockdown the consequences that we should have listened as politicians much better to the scientific evidence, and we should have given more value to the experiential knowledge. Listen to both. And that's important. It's not been a battle between the two, the traditional science and the new experientially related understandings and knowledge. But some really key issues, I think, and I've gathered these from talking with other people, I think have emerged, which are relevant for us today from COVID and having to live, work and involve people differently. And I think there's a number of particularly key words for me. One of them is ambiguity, that things can be both better and worse under the constraints of COVID and having to work in a distanced way. So that, for example, some people have really been excluded because of being unable to access computers and the rest, what we call digital exclusion, while others with some impairments have been able to play a much more equal part because they are able to communicate in ways they couldn't perhaps readily do in ordinary undertakings, where they may not be able to travel, for example. So better access for some, worse for others. For some, home working being a blessing and being better, for others, much more difficult. The difficult effects of Zoom and things like that for people, but also the ways in which they can make it that we're much more equal in a meeting rather than having some voices dominate the meeting. So what I've learned really is that the kinds of things we've had to turn to work in a distance way, the consequences of lockdown can be both good and be both bad, and for different people differently. And now we're faced with the issue here, and I think obviously in other places too, how we must fight for the long-term outcomes to be positive. And that's both generally in our lives, but also specifically in relation to our focus on involvement for carers and users in social work and beyond. And what's going to be really important is to fight, to challenge the kinds of restrictions that some ideologies might seek to impose on us, both from traditional ways of working, but also from the newer distance ways of working, which there may be real pressures to retain. And I think that means we've really got to work to seek choice and control over how things end up and are realised and done in a post-COVID world. And if the policy pressures are reactionary in society, as one fears they may be in the UK, how we can do more to connect with each other into both traditional and newer ways. And also, of course, it's not just a narrow us we're talking about, but we are seeking to be inclusive and treat all our diversity with equality so that there is a meaningful, inclusive involvement. And these goals, what's so interesting, these goals for our society are what involvement in social work, education, and mending the gap in microcosm are what it's always been about, and what they can really major in offering us understanding on for our broader lives. So I think what our kind of challenge is for the future is how we find ways of strengthening and maintaining inclusion in involvement in the light of both the old and the new approaches to involvement that we're going to have to be thinking about for the future. The distance and the direct, each with its strengths, each with its challenges. And that has to be a key ambition. And drawing on the learning from this, especially the kind of experiential knowledge of service users and carers, and as Vishanti reminds us, of all of us when we are brave enough to confront all of what's inside here. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Peter. And we do have time for some questions straight away. So please go ahead and turn on the microphone and the camera if you have a question for Peter. It's a little intimidating to all of a sudden be shown in a conference like this. But Peter, how do you see the paths forwards now? What can we learn? I mean, most of the progress that has been taking place in enhancing experience-based knowledge has been taking place in real life and in real meetings. What can we learn from this time, you think?
Well, for me, the issues that, especially from working on that last book, are so important. So what I feel, and it comes back to some of the things Vishanti was saying, what I feel is at the moment, here at least in the UK, an increasing gulf between the personal and the political, our personal politics and the kind of formal politics we have imposed upon us, which I feel are really out of tune with us as human beings, and also because they seem so much committed to making us dislike each other and not necessarily like ourselves. I think very damaging and divisive. So I think we've really got to work, as was already said by Vishanti, to not to be alienated from ourselves or from other people, and not to allow those voices, whether it's some of the media or some policymakers and politicians, not to permit them to do it to us and to other people. You know, one of the things that I can't quite get over is that our Prime Minister recently appointed a photographer for his dog at an estimated cost of £60,000 to £100,000 a year, just to take photographs of the dog, where my partner works as a welfare rights advisor, at home of course, with people phoning her who can't use computers, who have desperate problems with their benefits, who are old and have serious impairments, and everything about their right to an income is questioned. So I do feel there is such a degree of gap between our rights and needs as ordinary people and our politics to enable those to be realised in a fair and equal way, that we've got to keep going. And I do think it's so important that initiatives like PowerUs are absolutely the cutting edge of that different kind of understanding of what the political is. And it's about connecting us. And it's always one of the things I've loved about Mending the Gap, this enabling of building contact, and it can be even virtual contact, and understanding and sympathy, and most of all trust with people in different situations in relation to each other.
Thank you, Peter. I do see we have a question here from Tove Samselius. Please turn on your microphone and camera and put your question to Peter.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Samselius. I'm a researcher with, can you hear me?
Yes, a little uneven. A little uneven.
Not very well. Okay, wait. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm a researcher with Malmö University, and I also work for Save the Children. However, I have a long history in the UK. I used to work for an organisation called Single Parent Action Network for many years, and we did a lot of participatory research. One thing, I've just recently completed a PhD here in Sweden involving single mothers who are homeless. And one of the things that kind of really made me think about, and also that we noticed in the UK in recent years, is a question of time. So time to participate. So as the welfare state is becoming much more conditional, and people, so with universal credit and with the kind of changes to the welfare system. So in the UK, but in Sweden, maybe it's actually even, there are even more demands on people. But if you can just from a UK perspective, what that kind of means for us who are involved in wanting to do co-produced research, and the importance of kind of knowledge that can be imparted by people who are living in poverty or who are facing different kinds of hardship. But if they don't have the time to participate, what is our responsibility to make that happen in new ways or in different ways, and how do we go about doing that?
I think the only constraint is our imagination and the degree to which we actually talk with people in situations like that, and try and establish with them what might work, because time is precious. I've worked with people who have very little time because they have life-limiting conditions, who still felt able to make decisions to devote some of that to trying to get involved, knowing that it wouldn't have much effect for them, but their commitment to it having an effect for someone else. So it's how real it can feel, I think. I think what you're saying is so important, and it's another of the big structural issues, because the brutal truth is that women particularly, but it perhaps goes for everybody, but women especially, are now under the cudgel of an impossible work-life balance. And what we've been seeing here in the UK, of course, as you may have heard, is particularly women expected to educate their children at home, to be keeping the home going, to be having a job, etc., etc., and an impossible overloading of responsibilities where the idea of having any say is diminished. And of course, one of the terribly important consequences, which I've seen from the work of my partner, as well as more academically, of reducing the welfare state, is you massively reduce people's expectations, or even their thought it might be possible. And that's another frightener. So we're going against the grain in right-wing ideologies, but it just means we've got to keep going, and we've got to do it, you use the word, in a co-productive way, not thinking, oh, this is a problem, we've got to sort it, but how will we all sort it together? And I don't think necessarily these are problems with ready solutions. It'll be bit by bit that we have to try and do this, and really difficult, because there's no doubt in my mind as a citizen of this country in the UK, that people's expectations, their attitudes have been changed by at least a generation of right-wing politics in what I think is quite a damaging and individualizing way. At the same time, the kinds of hate that are generated in relation to sexuality, citizen status, ethnicity, I don't think that they match most people's actual behavior and feelings in relation to diversity in their own life. So that there are things to be worked on, but it means that major political parties that want to do the right thing need to move very much into the 21st century of thinking that things are different now. Human beings are different, and we need to start not just thinking about how might we get re-elected, but what would be worth our being re-elected. Why? And let's look at the really fantastic things, in one sense awful that they have to be there, but fantastic that they are. Black Lives Matter, which will not go away, Me Too, the environmental movement. These are really important counter-developments, which I think absolutely sum up the reality of people wanting to do something with very positive personal politics. It's a battle like this.
Sorry, Peter, thank you very much. And you've given us a lot to think about. It's time for me now to introduce our third keynote speaker.